The topic which I was going to talk about is pretty broad. It's about democracy and markets and the way the world order is evolving. There is a kind of a standard version on this, which I won't waste much time on. You've heard it and seen it often. The standard version is that there's a sharp break taking place in the nature of world order. There's a new era opening, which is an era of great promise for the growth of markets and growth of democracy. The United States has won a major victory. The Cold War, say 1989, definitive end, symbolizes the break and the new opening. There are other processes. The process of globalization has changed the nature of the world radically, and there's minimization of the state and an increase in market relations and so on. That's the general picture. It's even formalized as the Clinton doctrine. The National Security Advisor a couple of years ago, Anthony Lake, who's sort of the intellectual of the administration, presented the Clinton doctrine as expressing these views. His basic thesis was that until the end of the Cold War, the United States had been engaged in containing the threat to market democracy, but now that threat is suppressed, and we can now go on to enlarge the reach of market democracy as we'd been intending to do all along and are now free to do. I think there's a good deal of reason for skepticism about every aspect of this picture, every aspect. Some of the aspects of the picture are just flat wrong by everyone's agreement. Others are at least debatable. So it takes a minimization of the state. One of the main features of contemporary doctrine is that the day of the large active state is over, and that we have to minimize the state and move to more market principles. You can get an estimate as to the accuracy of that in the latest annual volume of the World Bank Development Report. They every year come out with their flagship publication, a lot of fanfare and so on. It's supposed to represent mainstream economic thinking. Kind of interesting because it rapidly oscillates from one year to the next, which may tell you something. This year is about the state and markets, and they give some data on the ratio of state expenditures to GNP worldwide, and it shows what people should have known. It's differentiated. There are some areas of the world where, in fact, the state is being minimized, that is, reducing relative to GNP, namely those areas that have been under the influence and control of the international financial institutions in the United States, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. In those areas, in fact, state expenditures relative to GNP are low and declining, and they're also all economic disasters. In the rich countries, OECD countries, that's the place where the ratio of state expenditures to GNP is the highest, and it's been going up. Went up quite sharply in the 1980s. It's still going up, though less sharply. In the Asian growth area, which has been essentially out of World Bank U.S. domination, state expenditures relative to GNP have been going up. They're not as high as the rich countries, but going up. So what you do have, there is a picture, namely the place where the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, U.S. government, in the areas where they can pretty much control policy, the state is indeed declining. It was always lower. It's getting still lower. And in fact, there's poverty is increasing in absolute terms as well as relative terms. And in general, there's an economic disaster, except for a small sector of the population. In the rich countries, exactly the opposite's happening. One might want to draw some conclusions from that. The World Bank doesn't. But anyway, those are the data about minimization of the state. What about markets? Is this a period of growth of markets? Well, no, and in fact, it's known not to be. So if you look at the technical literature by international economists and so on, they point out I'll quote one of the major scholarly studies of this by an economist of the GATT Secretariat, that the last 25 years have been a period of sustained assault on free markets, led by the rich countries, the OECD countries, with the United States far in the lead. Reaganite anti-market measures, he estimates at about 3 times the level of those of other OECD countries, and they're very severe. This, incidentally, is quite well known. You read, say, the Foreign Affairs, a review of every year they have a review, the review of the decade in 1990, reviewed the last decade by their editor. You know, this is the major establishment journal, pointed out that the Reaganites, I'll quote them, that the Reaganites had led the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s. They had shifted the United States from being a supporter of multilateral free trade to being its leading challenger, and the facts do bear that out. The Reagan administration, in fact, essentially doubled protection for U.S. markets by one or another device. They were more protectionist than all post-war administrations combined. And in fact, they boasted about this to the business community. They didn't keep it secret. That's only one part of their radical market interference. They also poured state subsidies into high technology industry under the usual military cover, and in many other ways made sure that at least wealthy sectors in the United States weren't going to have to face market discipline. And that was part of a sustained assault against markets all over, from the rich countries all over the world. On the other hand, it is differentiated. The poorer countries, particularly those that were under the influence and domination of the international financial institutions in the United States, the ones subject to what's called the Washington Consensus, which tells you where it's coming from, they did indeed open themselves up to markets with consequences that you can observe. Mexico was the most recent example. Case after case is a disaster for most of the population, but it's true that markets have been increasing there. There is also further differentiation. The last 25 years have been a period of restrictive measures on trade, but great liberalization of finance. That's a radical change. That really is a change, and a significant change in world order, but it didn't have anything to do with the Cold War. It took place starting 60s, but radically in the early 1970s, and that led to huge changes. So for the first time in modern history, financial flows have first of all been astronomical and very rapid, and also essentially uncorrelated to the real economy. So before this period, say 1970, about 90% of the capital interactions in foreign exchange were related to trade and investment, that is the real economy. About 10% were speculative. By now it's about 5% related to the real economy and about 95% speculative. The speculative flows are extremely rapid. About 80% of them have a turnaround time of a week, and most of that is a day, some of it is even minutes, and it's astronomical. It's just shot out of sight. By now it's over $1 trillion a day, totally, outweighing the resources of even rich countries, even the European Union and so on. So that's a big change. And that liberalization of capital has increased, but restriction on trade has increased along with it. That correlation is well known. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's a relationship. In fact, the whole post-war economic system was built on that relationship. When the United States and Britain designed the post-war economic system back, 1945, what's called the Bretton Woods system, it was designed to liberalize trade and restrict finance. So the system that was designed by Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes and the rest of them was designed specifically to try to increase trade. They thought that'd be a good thing, and in order to do that, to restrict capital. So their countries had capital controls. In fact, the OECD countries, the rich ones, maintained capital controls into the 1980s. There are countries that didn't, like Latin America. They're very free and open to international capital, and sub-Saharan Africa. So they have plenty of capital. They don't have capital controls, and you can see it. The famous debt crisis hit Latin America and did not hit East Asia, primarily for that reason. The capital flowed out of Latin America to New York banks and to London and so on. The rich people sent their money elsewhere, in other words, instead of investing it domestically. And the Latin American debt is not very different from capital flight. In other words, if they kept their money inside, the famous debt would barely be there. And that indeed is what happened in East Asia, which did have capital controls. It was understood by Keynes, White, and other designers of the world order from 1945 that these two things were generally an inverse relationship. As you liberalized capital, you tended to restrict trade, and conversely. And that remains true. Generally speaking, it's been true the last 25 years. Very radical liberalization of financial capital and a period of restrictiveness of trade. Even the so-called trade agreements are in fact not free trade agreements. They have very severe protectionist elements. I'll come back to that if there's time. Anyhow, the first picture about minimization of the state is true in a very differentiated fashion. It's not true for the rich countries, it's not true for East Asia. In fact, the opposite is true, but it is true for the poorer countries, and increasing for the poorer countries. And that, in fact, is part of the Washington Consensus. That's part of what's imposed on them. Now, actually, it's a little more nuanced than that, because another recent change is that internal to the rich countries, especially the United States and England, there's an analog to that. So the state has not declined relative to GNP in England and the United States under Thatcher and Reagan, but it's shifted. It's shifted to more and more service to the wealthy and less service to the rest of the population, which is the domestic analog to the international system. So yes, there is liberalization for the poor, like, 7-year-old children have to learn responsibility and, get out of that cycle of dependency and face market discipline and so on, but not rich people. They have to be protected from market discipline. They have to be protected by socialization of risk and socialization of cost, along with, of course, privatization of profit and management, but they don't want to face, they have to stay on the cycle of dependency. And that's become very striking in the Reagan and Thatcher years. So after 17 years of Thatcher, state expenditures relative to GNP were exactly what they were when she came in. But the shift in the way the state was functioning was quite substantial. So there was a very sharp increase in poverty, an increase in millions of children in poverty, hunger that hadn't been seen for 50, 60 years, childhood diseases that had been declining and essentially overcome are now back. And it's a kind of a Dickensian picture. At the same time, state expenditures are being used to, in fact, illegally, they keep having scandals to, subsidize aerospace exports and so on and so forth. That's a shift. Same here. I mean, we're all familiar with it, so I don't have to talk about it. But there's been a very sharp shift internally in the United States. In fact, you see it quite strikingly by looking at, everyone knows that, should know at least, that the United States has by far the highest level of inequality of any industrial society. And in fact, it's been, after having declined from about 1945 till around 1970, it's been increasing, and it's now back to what it was around the 1920s, and still going up. But that picture is not, it's true, but it's, again, good to disaggregate it, break it up into its components. The participation in the economy, what's called the market economy, but that's misleading. But what's participation in the economy leads to a certain distribution of income. Okay, so you have a job and spend money and so on. That leads to a certain distribution of income. Then comes a second factor, a social policy, which is taxes and transfers. Okay, so it's called government action, but in fact it's social policy. And the more democratic the society, the more people participate. So if you compare the United States with other industrial societies in market outcomes, what's the inequality there? Well, it's about the same as other societies. So the United States ranks along with the other industrial societies in terms of distribution of income from market outcomes. If you add the effect of social policy, the United States diverges radically. That's where the divergence comes in. So you take into account taxes and transfers, you find the inequality growing very sharply because that's the nature of social policy in the United States, increasingly in England, and that's the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. It's carried, it's not totally there, but they sort of symbolize it. Well, okay, those are decisions. They're not laws of nature, as you can see from the fact that they don't happen in other similar societies. But this is real. And it's in fact a domestic variant of the international picture that I just briefly sketched. There couldn't be a better symbol of this than Newt Gingrich, who's the leading, no one is more passionate about the need to break the, cycle of dependency and learn responsibility and all this sort of thing, but not the people in the district that he represents. Cook County, Georgia, a very rich suburb of Atlanta, he manages to maintain the record for bringing federal subsidies to his district. He's maintained it for some years because there, the rich folk in Cook County, they have to be saved from market discipline. They have to maintain the cycle of dependency. Just as the last budget went through, he managed to sneak in another $500 million for his favorite local charity, Lockheed Martin, which has corporate headquarters down there, and that's standard. I mean, this is like sort of symbolizes it, but the picture is quite general, and it's a picture you see all around you. You walk a couple of blocks towards Roxbury, you'll see it. Walk a couple of blocks towards the financial centers, you'll see the other side of it. And that's happening on a global scale as well. So again, in Latin America, there has been, which has been subjected to the Washington Consensus and is quite open to international capital flows and so on. There's an absolute increase in poverty with only two exceptions, Colombia and Chile. Colombia, it's largely because of the drug-based economy is a considerable part of that, and also because it maintains capital controls. In Chile, it's because, contrary to what you read, they have not accepted the Washington Consensus. So it's not a free market society. They, for example, do impose controls on short-term speculative capital flows, and in fact, their major export, copper, most of it comes from a nationalized company, which is quite efficient and so on. So they've managed some sort of nuanced form of development, whatever you want to call it, and though they're not tigers in the Asian sense, they're not disasters in the Mexican sense. Well, that picture seems fairly general, and it's enough to make one think, at least, about the sort of mantra, that we're entering into a new period of markets and minimization of state and so on and so forth. I think if you look closely, it's not that. What about democracy? Is it a new era of democracy? The result of the victory of the United States in the Cold War? Well, you can look at that too. For one thing, notice that to the extent that there is an extension of market principles, there's a decline in democracy. Those two things go hand in hand. When you minimize the state, you don't eliminate decision-making. You just transfer it. So it's not being made in the state system, it's being made somewhere else. And where it's the story is this is a transfer of power to the people, but that's not even a joke, so we don't have to waste any time on that. It's a transfer of power to the private sector, undoubtedly, but that's not the people.